A billionaire's daughter was bleeding from the inside. Slow. Hidden. The kind of bleeding that doesn't show on the skin until it's nearly too late. Acute myeloid leukemia, relapsed, and now her small body had stopped accepting the one thing keeping her alive. Platelets. The little cells that let blood clot, that close the 1,000 invisible cuts a body makes just by living. Hers were gone. And the donated ones, bag after bag, slid off her immune system like water off glass. Refractory, the doctors called it. It meant only one kind of platelet would hold. A perfect tissue match. HLA matched, rarer than a needle in a haystack the size of a country. And for 26 months, one woman walked into that hospital's donor center every 2 weeks, sat in a reclining chair for 2 hours with a needle in the crook of her arm, and gave those platelets away for free. Then she clocked back in, tied on a stained apron, and pushed a cart of lunch trays down a hallway 2 floors above the child she was keeping alive. She didn't know the child's name. She didn't know there was a child at all. And the man worth $3.7 billion, a man who'd built his fortune buying hospitals and teaching them to do more with less, had no idea that the only thing standing between his daughter and the dark was a woman his own firm had taught that very hospital to underpay. Then one night he found out. He found out all of it, and the woman who'd been saving his little girl for over 2 years was right there in front of him, on her knees, scrubbing somebody else's spilled lunch off the floor while his Bentley idled at the curb outside. What he did next would either give her back the lie she'd given up, or prove that when the powerful finally see you, it always comes with a price. Stay with me, because the sentence an old woman gave her granddaughter on a South Carolina sea island a long time ago, the one she'd whispered to herself the night everything broke, is the whole reason any of this ever happened. 26 months earlier, Etta Greer had just finished a 13-hour shift, and her feet had stopped being feet somewhere around hour 9. Now they were just 2 aching things she stood on. Her shoes were a pair of off-brand sneakers she'd resoled herself with a tube of shoe glue from the dollar store, because new ones were $34, and $34 was 4 days of her father's blood pressure medication. Her hands smelled like industrial dish soap and steamed table gravy. Her apron had a burn mark over the left hip from a tray of green beans that had come out of the warmer too fast. It was 6 in the morning. She should have gone home. Should have driven her 2009 Corolla with 211,000 miles on it back to the apartment, peeled off her shoes, and slept until her body forgot it had a body. Instead, she turned left past the staff cafeteria, down a corridor most people in that building didn't know existed, and pushed open the door of the donor center. The nurse at the desk looked up and smiled. Glenna knew her by now. Every 2 weeks, like the tide. "You're early, Etta," Glenna said. "Couldn't sleep anyway." Etta sat down in the aphoresis chair the way other people drop onto a bus stop bench. The machine beside her hummed and clicked. A centrifuge the size of a microwave that would pull her blood out, spin off the platelets, and give the rest back to her, warm through the same needle. 2 hours. She'd done it so many times she could feel the citrate before it came, that faint metallic tingle in her lips that meant the calcium in her blood was dropping. Glenna always set out the Tums. Etta always chewed to and never complained. "You know how rare you are," Glenna said, prepping the line. "It wasn't a question. We've got refractory patients in the system who can't take a single bag that isn't matched to them. HLA, you're a match for one of them. Has been for a long time. Most matches we find donate once, twice, get spooked by the needle, and we never see them again. She'd take down the tubing. You just keep showing up." Etta watched the first dark thread of her blood disappear into the machine. My big mama used to say something. The woman who'd raised her. Back home, down in the low country. She'd say, "What flows easy out of you, BB, might be the one thing somebody else can't live without." She said it the way some people say grace, not to sound deep, just stating a thing she'd believed since before she could spell it. "I've got something that flows easy. Doesn't seem right to keep it." Glenna didn't say anything. She just patted Etta's shoulder and went to check the cooler. Here is something most people walking past a hospital cafeteria never think about. There are roughly 4.5 million people working frontline support jobs in American hospitals, food service, housekeeping, transport, the aides who do the touching and the lifting and the cleaning, and a huge share of them earn poverty wages. You can work full-time wiping down a cancer ward and still qualify for food stamps. In a city like Houston, $14 an hour doesn't cover rent and groceries and a parent's medicine in the same month. The system doesn't run despite these people. It runs on them. It just doesn't pay them like it knows that. Etta made $13.85 an hour. After taxes, that came to about $1,920 a month. Her father's care came to roughly $3,400. Samuel Greer had had a stroke 2 winters ago, the kind that took the right side of his body and most of his words and left him needing dialysis 3 times a week on top of everything else. So Etta did the math the way she'd been doing it for 2 years. Pick up the double, skip the lunch, eat the trays that came back untouched from the rooms, the ones that would have been thrown out anyway because hospital rules said you couldn't, but hunger said you could. $1,140. That was what sat in her savings account. It had been sitting there, more or less unchanged, for a year, because every dollar that came in already had a name on it before it arrived. She never told anyone at work about her father. She didn't complain. She didn't ask. She showed up. She carried the trays. She gave her platelets. And she went home to a man who could no longer say her name, but who squeezed her hand twice when she came through the door, which she decided meant thank you. 3 weeks ago, Dale Pruitt had written her up. Dale ran food service for the night and early shifts, and he ran it like a man who'd read one book about efficiency and never recovered. He'd found her in a room on the oncology floor, sitting on the edge of a chair, telling a kid a story while the kid picked at a tray of applesauce. "You've got 40 trays to clear, Greer," he'd said, not looking up from his clipboard. "Not a daycare. Your food service. You drop the tray, you move on. That's the job. You want to babysit, go work a daycare. They don't pay either." He'd written it down. Lingering, off task, as if comfort were a thing that could be off task. Etta hadn't argued. Arguing with the man who controlled your schedule was a luxury, and luxuries were for people whose fathers didn't need dialysis. Earl Dawkins was the one who found her in the walk-in cooler afterward, breathing slow against the cold so her face wouldn't do anything in front of anyone. Earl had cooked in that kitchen for 19 years. Same low country, more or less, as her big mama. He called her baby, too, and meant it the same way. He didn't say anything wise. He just handed her a container, still warm, of the staff meal smothered chicken and rice he wasn't supposed to send home with anyone. "For your daddy," he said, "and take tomorrow's, too. I'll cover your tray line. Dale won't know." Then, on his way out, almost to himself, "The ones who do the most carrying always think they're carrying alone. You're not. Remember that part." She'd remember it later than she should have. That same week, clearing a cart of returns off the oncology floor, Etta found a friendship bracelet tangled in the napkin tray, knotted embroidery thread, pink and yellow and a green that had already started to fade. The kind of thing a kid makes 100 of when a hospital art therapist puts a basket of string in front of them and says, "Here, make something that's yours." She almost tossed it. Instead, she slipped it into her apron pocket, where it stayed, because throwing away something a sick child had made with their hands felt like a thing she just couldn't do. She didn't know whose it was. She didn't need to know. 2 floors up, in a room that smelled like fresh lilies instead of fryer grease, a different world ran on a different kind of money. Room 9 of the pediatric oncology unit at Magnolia Children's Medical Center didn't look like a hospital room. It looked like a hotel suite that happened to have an IV pole. There was a leather recliner, a private nurse en rotation, a window framing the whole green sprawl of the Texas Medical Center, and on the bed, propped on too many pillows, a 5-year-old girl named Lila Whitlock, pale as the inside of a shell, watching a tablet with the sound off. Her father sat beside her, and her father was Crawford Whitlock, 53 years old. Chairman and founder of Whitlock Hale Capital, a private equity firm that had, over 20 years, bought up surgical centers and dialysis clinics, and yes, hospital systems, including the one his daughter was dying in. His watch was a Patek Philippe. He'd flown in that morning on a Gulfstream G700 from a deal in New York he hadn't bothered to close. Wharton was stitched into the lining of a man he'd been 30 years ago. He had a reputation, in the rooms where these things are decided, as the man who could walk into a bleeding hospital and find the fat, the redundant staff, the overstaffed shifts, the labor inefficiencies, and cut until the numbers turned black. He'd made a great deal of money teaching institutions to need fewer people. And he could not, with all of it, find one bag of platelets that would keep his daughter's body from turning on itself. Dr. Priya Raghavan came in quietly, the way she always did. Transfusion medicine. Young for the title and tired in a way that hadn't reached her hands yet. She checked the monitor, checked the bag draining slowly into Lila's arm, made a note. "Is this one holding?" Crawford asked. He didn't look at her. He was watching the drip. "This one's matched. It should hold longer than the random units did." Raghavan paused. "Mr. Whitlock, you understand we can't manufacture this. A matched platelet donor isn't something a budget produces. Lila's immune system has decided what it will and won't accept, and the only thing it accepts comes from a person whose tissue type lines up with hers. There are maybe a handful of people in this entire region who match. We can't synthesize them. We can't pay them into existence. All we can do is hope the right one keeps showing up." "And do they?" Crawford's jaw was tight. "Keep showing up?" Raghavan looked at the screen for a second too long. "Yours has. The same donor. Consistently for over 2 years. Without being asked." She closed the file before she could say more. Crawford turned the question over and found no purchase on it. 2 years. Someone had been keeping his child breathing for 2 years, and he didn't know if it was a man or a woman, young or old, rich or, and here the thought stopped him cold, almost certainly not rich, because rich people didn't sit in donor chairs every 2 weeks for free. "I want to thank them," he said. "You can't know who they are. That's not a wall I built, Mr. Whitlock. It's the one that keeps people like them safe from people like you." He let that land. He was a man who'd spent his life finding the seam in any wall. On the bed, Lila set down the tablet. "Daddy, I'm not scared," she said, which is the kind of thing a child only says when she is. She'd learned to read his face the way the rest of them read the monitors. When his eyes went wet, she'd start narrating her own bravery. "I'm fine. It doesn't even hurt, look," to talk him back from whatever ledge he was standing on. A 5-year-old, managing a billionaire. Then she reached under her pillow and pulled out a bracelet, pink and yellow and fading green, half finished. The thread still pinned to a safety pin clipped to her blanket. "I'm making one for my platelet angel," she told Raghavan, holding it up. "The lady who gives me the special blood that stays. Nurse Glenna says it's a lady. I don't know her name, but she's real, and she comes every 2 weeks, so I'm gonna keep making them till she comes to get one." "You think she'll come?" Raghavan's smile didn't quite hold. "I think," she said carefully, "that she'd love it." Crawford watched his daughter knot a thread with fingers gone thin, bruised from the needles, making a gift for a stranger she was certain would one day walk through that door. But what Crawford Whitlock didn't know, what would have undone him on the spot if he'd known, was that his daughter's angel was, at that exact moment, 2 floors below him, rinsing the lunch tray off Room 9's cart, with one of those very bracelets sitting forgotten in her apron pocket. And if you think you can see where this is going, stay with me anyway. Because the night these two finally stand in the same room, it doesn't happen the way anyone would script it. The Thursday it all came apart, Etta got 2 pieces of news 4 hours apart, and neither one waited its turn. The first came at 3 in the afternoon, in the windowless office of the dialysis center's social worker, a kind woman with a binder full of forms that all said the same thing in different fonts. Samuel's access, the surgical port in his arm that made dialysis possible, was failing, clotting. He needed a procedure to revise it, and soon, or they'd have to move to a temporary catheter in his chest, which carried its own risks for a man whose body was already tired of surviving. The procedure was scheduled. The procedure was also, after what insurance wouldn't cover, $4,200 out of pocket. Etta had $1,140. She did the math the way she always did it, fast and silent, the calculator in her head running while her face stayed still. There was no version of the math that worked. There was no shift she could pick up that closed a $3,100 gap before next Thursday. She thanked the social worker. She drove back to the hospital for her night shift because missing it would only make the hole deeper. She did not cry in the car. She'd save that. She was good at saving that. The second piece of news she wasn't supposed to hear at all. It was 9:40 at night, and she was restocking the supply cart outside the oncology floor's clean utility room when two nurses came around the corner talking in the clipped, too fast way hospital people talk when something is going wrong upstream. Room 9, the Whitlock kid. She's bleeding. Nose won't stop. They found blood in her urine. Counts 9,000 and falling. They transfusing? With what? She's refractory. Random platelets do nothing. They need her HLA match and there's not a matched unit in the city. Raghavan's been on the phone since 7 calling every bank in the region. Nothing. If they don't get matched platelets into her before morning, they're looking at a brain bleed in a 5-year-old. They turned the corner. They were gone. Etta stood very still. 9,000. Falling. Before morning. Refractory. HLA match. Her match, because Glenna had told her, months ago, in that offhand way, "You're a match for one of our refractory kids. You keep that little one alive and you don't even know it." One of them. A little one. Room 9. She had given platelets 9 days ago. The rule lived in her body by now. They liked you to wait. Her own count would be on the low side this soon. Borderline. The kind of borderline where a careful nurse defers you and sends you home with juice and a sticker. Donating again tonight would be early. It would be reckless. If her platelets were already down and she gave more, she could tip into a place where her own blood forgot how to clot. And she was the only person on earth who drove her father to dialysis, who read the bills, who squeezed his hand twice back. If she went down, 2 people went into the dark, not 1. She knew all of this. She'd known all of it before she finished the thought. She left the supply cart in the middle of the hallway. The donor center was half dark, 1 nurse on, and it wasn't Glenna. "We're closed for walk-ins," the woman said. "We open at, I'm an HLA match for the Whitlock child, room 9, the refractory one. They need matched platelets before morning, and there isn't a unit in the city." Etta was already rolling up her sleeve. "Pull my file. I match. Take mine." The nurse blinked. "When did you last donate?" 9 days ago. "Then I can't. You're inside the interval. Your count's likely low. I'd be putting you at. I know exactly what you'd be putting me at." Etta's voice didn't rise. It went the other way, low and flat and certain, the voice of a woman who'd done the arithmetic before she walked through the door. "There's a little girl 2 floors up who's going to bleed into her brain tonight if nobody gives her what only a handful of people in the city can. I'm one of them. I'm here. So check my file, page whoever you need to page, and take it. I'll sign whatever says it was my choice." The nurse looked at her for a long second. Then she picked up the phone and paged Dr. Ravelon. 2 floors apart, a child and the woman who'd been saving her for over 2 years, separated by a concrete slab and a wall of anonymity that was, right then, beginning to crack. Raghavan came down in 4 minutes. She took one look at the name on the screen, and something moved behind her eyes, something heavy, something she couldn't say. Because Priya Raghavan knew. She knew the donor's name because she'd seen it on the matched unit logs every 2 weeks for 2 years. She knew the patient's name. She knew, standing there, that the tired woman in the burned apron offering up her own blood against medical advice was the same woman who'd been quietly keeping Crawford Whitlock's daughter alive without ever being told there was a daughter at all. She wanted to say it. "The child you're saving is the same one whose tray you clear. She's been making you bracelets. She calls you her angel. Every cell in her wanted to break the wall. But the wall existed for a reason, Anonymity protected donors from exactly the kind of pressure and gratitude and obligation that could follow them home. And Raghavan had taken an oath to hold that wall even when holding it felt like a cruelty of its own. "You understand the risks," Raghavan said. "It wasn't a question either. I understand them. And you want to proceed." "I need to proceed," Etta said. "There's a difference." Ravam was quiet. Then she pulled a chair over herself, and she drew the blood herself, and she watched the machine begin its slow work of separating out the one thing a stranger's child could not live without. What Etta had given up to come here, she didn't fully understand yet. Rewind 2 weeks, to the night she almost didn't show up at all. It had been a slow night on the oncology floor, and Etta had broken Dale Pruitt's rule. She dropped the last tray in room 9 and found the kid awake, pale, restless, the IV pole standing guard beside her like a thin metal angel. The girl had asked in the blunt way only small children manage, whether the ocean was scary. And Etta, who should have moved on, who had 11 more trays and a supervisor who counted minutes, had set down her clipboard and sat on the edge of the chair and told her about the low country. About tide water so warm in summer it felt like the creek was breathing with you. About her big mama wading out at dawn into the marsh with her skirt tucked up, raking oysters, saying the water remembered every kind thing anyone had ever done near it. The girl had listened with her whole face. And then the girl had reached under her pillow and pulled out a bracelet, pink and yellow and a green going pale, and held it up. "This is for my platelet angel," she'd said. "She gives me the special blood that stays inside me. I never met her, but she's real. Nurse Clena said it's a lady. I'm making her one for when she comes." Etta had looked at the bracelet. She'd looked at the empty platelet bag still hanging on the pole. And she had not put the two together because why would she? She cleared trays. She gave platelets. Those were two different things she did in two different parts of the same building. And the wall stood between them precisely so that no one would ever stand where she was standing and feel what she would later feel. She'd told the girl the angel was surely happy to do it. She'd tucked the bracelet back under the pillow. She'd taken her clipboard and gone. She'd had a bracelet just like it in her apron pocket for weeks. Now, 2 weeks after that, on the night before the bleed, Etta had sat in her Corolla in the parking garage at 3 in the morning and very nearly decided to stop. Stop donating. Just for a while. Her count was low, her body was tired, her father needed her whole, and the social worker's number, $4,200, sat in her chest like a stone. She could not be a wall holding up two people. Something had to give, and the only thing in her life she could choose to stop giving was the thing she gave to strangers for free. She put her forehead against the steering wheel, and she cried the way she only ever cried alone, not the pretty kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere underneath the ribs, the kind that has no audience and wants none. She cried because her father couldn't say her name. She cried because she'd given away a part of herself 47 times in 26 months, and no one had ever once said thank you. And she hated that some small starving part of her wanted them to, because wanting thanks for kindness felt like it made the kindness counterfeit. That was where Earl found her the next morning, before the day shift, when she came in red-eyed and quiet. She told him, not all of it, enough, that she was thinking of stopping, that she couldn't carry everyone, that maybe being good was a thing you couldn't afford on $13.85 an hour. Earl didn't tell her she was wrong. He set a coffee down in front of her, the bad break room coffee, and he said it plain. Your big mama's line, the one you say. He'd heard it. She said it under her breath sometimes without knowing. What flows easy out of you might be the one thing somebody else can't, live without. He tapped the table once. She didn't put a but on the end of it, baby. She didn't say unless you're tired. The day you start measuring it, it stops being the thing she gave you. It's just a bank account with feelings. He stood up. You won't stop. I know you won't. That's not a compliment. It's just true. She didn't stop. Which is how, 9 days later, she ended up in the donor chair against every rule, giving a child she'd never knowingly met the one thing that child could not live without. Upstairs, none of them knew where it came from. They only knew it came. Crawford Whitlock had spent the worst night of his life in a leather recliner watching numbers. 9,000. 8. The bleed from his daughter's nose, packed and packed again. Ragavan in and out, on the phone, her face giving nothing. He had offered her things. At one point, somewhere past midnight, fully unraveled, he had told her he would move $10 million into the hospital's endowment by end of day if she would simply tell him who the matched donor was so his people could find them, fly them in, do whatever it took. Ragavan had looked at him with an expression that made him feel, for the first time in 20 years, small. And if I sold you a name for $10 million, she'd said, what would that make this place? You'd be buying a person's private body off a spreadsheet. The answer is no. It's no at 10. It's no at 100. And she'd walked out, and he'd sat in the dark and understood, slowly, that there was at last a thing his money could not reach. Then, at 4 a.m, a nurse came in carrying a single bag, matched, fresh, and hung it, and within the hour the bleeding slowed, and Lila's color crept back from the color of paper toward the color of a living child, and Crawford Whitlock put his face in his hands and shook. He didn't know whose blood it was. He just watched it save her. If you've made it this far, take 1 second and subscribe, because what happens in the next 10 minutes is the reason this story exists. And you do not want to be guessing where it went. He found out 2 nights later, and he found it out the way the wall could never quite prevent. He'd come back to the hospital at midnight because he couldn't sleep, couldn't stop hearing Ragavan's voice saying there's not a matched unit in the city. He was walking the back corridor toward the elevator when he passed the donor center, its door propped open, 2 nurses inside closing up, and he heard a name. Etta came in early again. That's twice this cycle. Glenna's worried she's running her own count into the ground for that refractory kid. A laugh, soft. That woman, 47 donations. Food service of all things, clears trays all day, gives platelets on her breaks, never once asked who gets them. The Whitlock girl would have been gone 3 times over without her. Crawford stopped walking. Etta. Food service. 47 donations. The Whitlock girl. His girl. He knew the name the way you know a word you've read 100 times without ever once reading it. A name on an apron. A face he'd stepped around in a hallway, in an elevator, outside his own daughter's door, the woman with the tray cart, always there, never seen. Background. Furniture. A labor line on somebody's spreadsheet. The exact kind of line a man like him had built a fortune teaching hospitals to trim. He didn't go to the elevator. He followed the sound of wheels on tile, around one corner and then another, down to the 3rd floor, until he reached the east corridor, and there she was. Etta was on her knees on the linoleum. A patient had been sick in 312, and there was a mess on the floor, and she was scrubbing it out by hand with a rag and a spray bottle. Methodical, careful, taking the kind of quiet pride in it that a person only takes when no one is watching and the work still matters to them anyway. Here is what almost no one outside that hallway understands. When a leukemia patient becomes refractory, money stops being the variable. You cannot purchase a tissue type. A matched platelet donor for a refractory child might be 1 in tens of thousands, and the national supply of platelets runs perpetually short because they expire in days, not weeks. A man worth $3.7 billion could not, with all of it, conjure what this woman carried in her veins and gave away on her breaks. The rarest thing in that building was on her knees with a rag. Crawford Whitlock stood at the end of the corridor and looked at her, really looked, for the first time in 2 years of walking past, and felt something open in his chest that he had no name for. He had walked past her 100 times. He had built an empire on the promise that you could optimize a hospital, do more with less, and the less had a name. And her name was Etta, and she was the reason his daughter was alive. He took 1 step toward her. The rag stopped moving. She looked up. He opened his mouth to thank her. What she said next would put a billionaire on his knees on a hospital floor at midnight, and it would not be the thing he came to hear. If you've ever wondered what you'd actually do if the person you'd wronged turned out to be the person who saved you, keep watching, because this is the part most people get wrong, and Ada didn't. The man in the expensive coat said, "You're the donor. The matched one. For 2 years." His voice wasn't the voice of a man who gave orders. It had come loose somewhere. "You saved my daughter." Etta sat back on her heels, the rag still in her gloved hand. She didn't recognize him. Rich men in good coats all looked the same to her by midnight. "I gave platelets," she said carefully. "That's all. Anybody who mashed could have done it. They didn't. 47 times, nobody else did. Only you." He took a breath that shook on the way down. "Which child?" she said. "Which one is yours?" Because there were a dozen kids on that floor, and she'd carried trays to all of them. "Lila, room 9. She's 5. She has." His throat closed. "She makes bracelets. Pink and yellow. She calls the donor her platelet angel. She's been making them for 2 years for a woman she's sure is going to walk through that door one day." The corridor went very quiet. Somewhere a monitor beeped, patient and far away. Etta reached into her apron pocket, slow, and took out the bracelet she'd carried for weeks. Pink and yellow and a green gone pale. She looked at it in the fluorescent light, and she looked at the empty space in her own chest where 2 separate things she did in 2 separate parts of. One building had stood apart for 26 months, and she watched the wall between them come down all at once. The ocean girl. The bracelet on the pillow. "This is for my platelet angel." The empty bag on the pole. She had sat on the edge of that child's bed and told her about the low country and tucked her back in and never once known that the blood the girl was thanking and the woman telling the story were the same person. "I told her about the water," Etta whispered. She asked if the ocean was scary. "I told her about my big mama." And then Crawford Whitlock, 53 years old, worth $3.7 billion, a man whose name was on buildings, knelt down. Right there on the linoleum she'd just cleaned, in his good coat, on both knees, but he didn't kneel to thank her. "I walked past you," he said, 100 times, in the lobby, in the elevator, outside her door. I never saw your face. I never learned your name." His hands were open on his knees, useless. "I built my whole fortune teaching hospitals like this one to run on fewer people, to find the waste. And the waste had a name, and it was yours. And you were keeping my daughter alive on your lunch break for $13 an hour, while I flew in to tell your bosses to cut 12 more like you." He looked up at her. "I'm not sorry I missed a stranger. I'm sorry I built a machine to make sure I'd never have to see you at all." "Please get up," Etta said. "Sir, please." She reached down and took his arm the way she'd lift a patient, the way she'd steady her father, and she helped a billionaire up off the floor. He collected himself the way men like him do when they want to fix a thing. He pulled out his phone. "Your father," Ragavan told me. "The dialysis. I'll cover the procedure tonight. I'll cover all of it, the rest of his life. $6 million into an account in your name, by morning no conditions. Get you back into your nursing program, whatever you need. Name it, and it's done." "No," Ada said. He blinked. In his world, no was a starting number. "No, I don't want your money, Mr. Whitlock." Her voice was steady, and her eyes had gone somewhere past sad into something clear. "If you pay me, it stops being a gift. It turns into a bill," she settled. "And my big mama told me the things that flow easy out of you might be the one thing somebody else can't live without." She didn't say, "unless there's a check at the end." "I won't put a price on it. Not your 6 million. Not anybody's." "Then what?" His voice cracked. "I can't walk away from this. I won't. You're the reason she's breathing. Tell me what to do with that." Etta looked down the long corridor she'd cleaned 10,000 times. At the building she entered every night and left every morning and was never once seen inside. "You want to do something." She met his eyes. "Then change how your hospitals treat people like me." "Not me. All of us. Every aide and cook and cleaner and tray pusher and transporter who does the touching and gets paid the least and never gets a thank you or a living wage. You found the waste? We're not the waste. We're the thing holding the whole place up. She didn't beg. She didn't shout. She didn't soften it to make him comfortable and build the registry. A real one. So no other little girl spends a night at 9,000 and falling because nobody knew where her one match was scrubbing a floor. You move money for a living, Mr. Whitlock. Move it at that. Crawford Whitlock stood in the corridor and looked at a woman who had just turned down more than she'd earned in 3 lifetimes and asked instead for something she'd never personally see a dime of. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt small in the good way. The way you feel small standing at the foot of something you have a lot of growing left to do. He brought her up to room 9 the next afternoon. Layla was sitting up, color back, drawing. When the door opened and her father said, "Buddy, the platelet angel is real, and she came, and she's right here." The little girl looked at Etta and looked at the empty bag on the pole and looked at Etta again. And the math a 5-year-old does has no wall in it at all. "You're the angel and the ocean lady." Her eyes went enormous. "You're 2 people." "No, sweetheart." Etta's laugh came out cracked down the middle. "I'm just one. I just do 2 things." Lila reached under her pillow and pulled out a bracelet, the finished one, worn soft from 2 years of being slept on and shown to every nurse who came through. "Pink and yellow and pale green. I knew you'd come," she said, holding it up. "So I kept making them. This one's the best one. It's yours." Etta took it with both hands. It was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given her. He fixed the system. It took him 11 weeks. 11 weeks of lawyers and board calls and conversations that started polite and got loud because Crawford Whitlock, whatever else he was, had always been very good at making a thing happen once he'd decided that had to. The first thing was the Open Hands Initiative, a $4 an hour raise across the board for every frontline support worker in the entire Whitlock Hale Hospital network, not just the one in Houston. Food service, housekeeping, transport aides, every person who'd been a line item on a spreadsheet he used to sign. Plus, a fund for certifications and continuing education, so the people who held the place up could climb inside it if they wanted to. Here is a thing the brochures for private equity and healthcare never mention. When a firm buys a hospital and squeezes it for returns, the savings almost always come out of the same place. The lowest paid people, the ones doing the most direct care. Cut the aides, stretch the cooks, freeze the wages, and the spreadsheet turns green while the floor quietly falls apart. Crawford had built a fortune finding that green. Now he understood in a way no quarterly report had ever taught him exactly whose backs it had been sitting on. The second thing was the Cordelia Greer Fellowship. Full tuition and a living stipend for any support staff worker anywhere in the network who wanted to go back and finish a healthcare degree. He named it for Ada's grandmother. He didn't ask permission. Some things you don't need permission to honor. The third thing was the biggest. He took the part of his firm that was best at moving resources where the math said they should go, and he pointed it at a national HLA-matched platelet donor registry, real-time matching, automated alerts, a system built so that no refractory child in the country would ever again hit 9,000 and falling because nobody knew where their one rare match was standing. The machine he'd built to find what could be cut, rebuilt to find what could not be replaced. At the lunch, in the hospital auditorium on a Thursday in spring, he stood at the podium in front of 400 people and told them plainly that his daughter was alive because of a woman who cleared lunch trays for $13.85 an hour, a woman he had walked past 100 times and never seen. In the third row, Dale Pruitt sat with his arms crossed because he'd been told attendance was mandatory and not why. By the end, his arms had come uncrossed and fallen to his sides. No one fired him. No one named him. The motive of this whole thing was never punishment. The point was that a system could be ashamed enough to change. Etta sat in the back and did not stand when the room stood. She wept, quiet, because her grandmother's name, the woman who'd raised her on a sea island where almost nobody had 2 nickels to rub together, was on a fellowship now. And one more thing happened that she could never quite prove. Her father's access procedure was paid in full by a hospital charity fund she'd never heard of. No name attached. The paperwork clean. The woman who'd given anonymously 47 times found herself, for the first time, on the other side of the wall, receiving from a giver she couldn't name, grateful into the dark. She knew. She couldn't prove it. She didn't try to. A year later, Etta walked into a lecture hall in the nursing program she'd walked away from a long time ago, carrying a backpack with a hospital ID still clipped to the front pocket, wearing the same resoled sneakers because she hadn't found time to buy new ones, surrounded by students half her age who had never once cleared a tray or run their own platelets into the ground for a stranger. She sat in the third row, opened her notebook, and on her wrist, faded soft, was a friendship bracelet in pink and yellow and pale green. 3 years after that, on a bright Saturday in June, Etta Greer crossed a stage in a cap and gown and shook the dean's hand and became, at last, the thing she'd given up at 22, a registered nurse. She'd chosen oncology. Of course she had. In the audience, Samuel Greer sat in his wheelchair, thinner, older, alive, and when his daughter's name was called, he squeezed the armrest twice with his good hand, which everyone around him understood to mean thank you, even if only one person knew the language. Beside him sat a girl of 8 now, tall and healthy and bored in the way only a well child can be. Bored at a long ceremony until they called the name, and then Lila Whitlock shot up out of her seat holding something over her head, a bracelet, frayed at the edges, the green almost white now from 7 years of handling. Pink and yellow. She'd kept it. She'd kept it the whole time. Etta found it from the stage, that small bright thing in a sea of faces. And she didn't speak, because there was nothing big enough to say. She looked instead at her own hands. The same hands that had scrubbed floors and pushed trays and opened a vein 47 times so a child she'd never met could keep breathing. The same hands that would hold the stethoscope now. Same hands, different work. Same person. Her big mama's voice moved through her, quiet and certain, the way it always did when she needed to remember who she was. What flows easy out of you, baby, might be the one thing somebody else can't live without. In her new apartment, the one with a lock on her own door, the worn bracelet hangs on the lamp by her bed, in the place of honor, where the first thing she sees every morning is the cheapest, most valuable thing she owns. There are people in your life right now who are giving everything they have and getting nothing back for it. People who show up, do the hardest and quietest work and never get seen. They're in your hospitals, in your schools, in your buildings, pushing carts and wiping tables and holding the hands of people whose names they'll never make the papers for knowing. And most of us walk right past them, the way a billionaire once walked past the only person who could save his child. So here's the truth Etta's grandmother knew, and I'll leave it with you. Kindness given in secret doesn't pay you back on your schedule. Sometimes it takes 2 years. Sometimes it never circles back at all. You give it anyway, because the giving is the point. Now I want to know what you'd really do, and this one will divide the room. If the person who never once saw you, who profited off keeping you invisible, knelt down and offered you everything, would you take the check, or would you do what Etta did and ask for something you'd never get to keep? There's no right answer. Tell me yours in the comments. I read them. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay close. These stories aren't just stories, they're mirrors, and you never know which one is going to show you your own face. Share this with the person who showed up for you back when nobody else did. They should hear that you noticed. This story is a work of fiction. The names, characters, and events came out of imagination, and any resemblance to real people is coincidence. But I'll tell you honestly, I wrote it because there's a woman who worked nights in the hospital where my mother was sick, and I never learned her name either, and I've thought about that for a long time. If you have a rare tissue or blood type, please think about becoming a regular donor. You might be the only match a child has. Until next time, stay kind, stay giving, and never once believe that the quietest person in the room is the smallest.